Hi, Rebecca. How are you today?
Hi, Elizabeth. It's good to see you. Thanks for having me. I'm pretty good. How are you?
I'm doing really good. It's about to be a 3-day weekend, though this won't be posted for a couple weeks, but I'm really enjoying the weather and excited.
Oh, me too. I didn't realize that it was a 3 weekend for you there as well, because I'm in Canada and we have Labor Day this Monday. Is it the same for you?
Yes, we
Yeah,
also have Labor Day.
yeah.
I'm I don't know how it came to be about the way the same
The same
holiday
day.
because it's a
Yeah.
totally made up holiday, but
Interesting.
yes.
Cool.
So let's go ahead and why don't you tell my audience a little bit about who you are, the kind of work you do, and how I know you.
Sure. My name's Rebecca, and I'm a psychotherapist in Ontario. And I've been a therapist for just over 10 years. I have a private practice. And what I do is primarily individual, like one on one therapy. And I specialize in depth therapy, so that's like Jungian, Freudian approaches. And I believe you and I met through a mutual coaching group for therapists called Business Mastery. So that was a year long and just recently finished.
Yeah. And I remember when we started talking, you brought up Jungian archetypes in your work, and I was super excited because I like to geek out on that too a little bit.
Yeah, it's nice to find others that have that common thread interest because you don't always hear about that these days.
Yeah, CBT has kind of taken over the world, and we don't always go back into some of the older modalities.
Yeah,
And
especially in North America, like from what I understand in Europe, they're still valuing more of like Jungian and psychoanalytic approaches. But yeah, in the West, it seems to be like a lot of CBT, solution focused therapy approaches.
yeah, it's hard because I want to give my clients what they want, and I know how much value some of the deeper work has. And so it's finding that balance between what they value and what's really going to help. And sometimes it's just your guess on what's going to help.
Yeah, and for me, I find there's like a Venn diagram where the clients I work with are looking for what I offer because I try to make it as clear as possible, my approach. And so then it draws in people that are interested in that, this idea of an aligned client or like the right fit. So sometimes that's helpful for me too.
Yeah, I try to be very explicit on my website about who I work with, the type of work I do. And I, like a lot of therapists, I offer 20-minute consult. And it really is to say, wait a minute, this is who I am. This is the kind of stuff you're going to get from me. Make sure you like that. Because there's nothing worse than having to work with a therapist for 4 or 5 sessions and then be like, oh, I don't like you. Let me switch over
Right.
here. And then you have to tell your story all over again. And it's icky. Nobody wants to do that.
Yeah,
So,
just being upfront. The one tricky part can be like a lot of clients won't have a specific type of therapy they're looking for. They just know that they want to feel better. And sometimes doctors will tell them, hey, you need CBT. That's the only type of therapy typically that they'll recommend, at least where I'm at. And so that can be a bit of an education opportunity of like why I use the approach that I do. But yeah, sometimes that there's a lot of misconceptions about what's useful or why.
one of the struggles I have with CBT is, to be quite honest, I use it all the time anyway. I think most of us do. It's almost a bedrock of any therapy I provide. So I do a lot of depth work. And I can't do depth work until we can acknowledge what's a cognitive distortion or not, until we can identify a feeling versus a thought versus an action, which is some of the core work of CBT. And you can't really do a lot of depth until we can go, hey, that memory you have, what was a feeling versus an assumption versus an actual thought versus the actions that were taken by people. So
Yeah.
this idea that it's CBT or Jungian, CBT or ACT or couples, the reality is most therapists that have been trained in the past 20 years use CBT all the time in all the different
Yeah.
modalities. At least that's been my experience working with different clinicians.
Yeah, me too. And I'm sure that there will be different therapists that have views about CBT, But I do remember one of my professors who was more psychoanalytically oriented, who said basically that CBT is the basics of therapy. It means you're talking about your thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. So it's pretty fundamental, right? And I guess if someone was like only a CBT therapist or doing it really strictly, like I know sometimes with that approach, they have the agenda and they decide up front what's going to be talked about today. They're really focused on thought record sheets. But at a very fundamental level, it's also just about exploring your thoughts, feelings, and how that affects your behavior.
Yeah, and one of the interesting parts from my work is I love nonviolent communication. I found it extremely helpful in all my works with couples and with individuals. And while I'd love to say it's because it reduces conflict, which it does, a lot of it's because it helps us put into words some of our thoughts and our feelings in a way that's less aggressive. Because we don't want to be aggressive, we're not trying to be aggressive, but we don't know how to say. Feelings are big, thoughts can be direct, and we know we don't want to say this thing that hurts somebody, but we also need to say words in general. And so having the NVC framework has been really helpful for a lot of people I've worked with. But you can only use NVC if we've done all the CBT work. If we've already identified what's a thought, what's a feeling, what are the actions, what is the impact I want to have from what I'm expressing, what's probably true, what's not, how do I ask for the assumptions. We can't even do NVC until we've done some of that basic CBT work.
Yeah, totally. And I'm sure more about NVC than I do, but I do have a couple of resources that's about emotion identification, and then what I really love connected to that is needs, because it talks about needs that we might call positive, but it frames it as needs or emotions when your needs are met, like positive emotions, or what we call negative emotions, which means it's pointing to certain needs that maybe are not being met for you. So I just find that really interesting.
I struggle with the needs question. I think because I do so much work with couples, because so many needs are in conflict. We all have a need for autonomy and for companionship. We have a need for independence and for support. And especially when you have two couples that have core needs that are opposite of each other, right? Somebody needs a little alone time to process their feelings, and somebody else needs like reassurance and hugging. And at this moment, you literally can't meet both needs at the same time.
Yeah.
And finding ways to negotiate that has been a big part of my work recently. And I think it's because in any relationship, there's this whole negotiation. And business relationships, it's easier. Like we had a whole negotiation about when to meet today, but our feelings, our disappointments are so small that it's very easy to breathe through them, manage them, negotiate to middle ground. I think it's really hard to negotiate when it's about safety and security and love. That makes it really hard to pull apart. Okay, what's a core need and where am I flexible?
Yeah.
Because it all feels so important.
Yeah, and what's an area that we can be flexible around our needs? What are the hills we're going to die on? And I'm just thinking about relationships and negotiation. But also what you said reminds me of, you go through that same process internally as just as an individual, because there's different parts of you that need and want different things. And then they're also like battling it out and trying to figure out how to come to that compromise.
That kind of brings me to where I usually start my interviews, which is around the state of mental health in the world right now. And I think I thought of that because as an American, we're in the middle of our election cycle. And as a therapist watching the election cycle, it's really, I think there's a little distance there, which helps me disassociate for how uncomfortable it feels. But there are these really big competing needs, and they feel really important to the people involved. And how are they negotiating that? And all the normal negotiation channels, at least from my point of view, feel broken right now. And that's what I'm watching. But that's my point of view, and I'm here to interview you. When you look at the world from the east coast of Canada, What are you seeing? What are you noticing? What are you thinking about these days?
In terms of mental health or like politically or?
Kind of the mental health of the world, yeah.
Yeah. It's such a big question, and I guess as a therapist, I'm also thinking about it from the experience of being a therapist. So on the one hand, I love that mental health is being talked about more. I love that it's a double-edged sword, but it's great that the topic's on social media and people are having these conversations. And silver lining of the last 5 years and how the world changed is that therapy is now a bit more accessible to communities that are very small and didn't have a lot of therapists, or more accessible to people that maybe can't get out to, it's too much anxiety to actually leave and go to a therapist's office. So I love that part too. I don't know if it's the shadow side, but one of the difficult parts that's also come with it being more talked about, and whether that's like at governmental levels, it's been talked about more socially, social media, there's just more of a presence, is that capitalism is also trying to get its foot in the door with this topic. And what I mean by that is that there are large corporations out there that hire therapists en masse, and unfortunately a lot of the time it's escalating burnout in the field because they're getting underpaid, which requires overworking, and that actually long term is not good for the public because it means less therapists will be available, and either more people will leave the field, or they'll have less capacity, or maybe they just won't be able to be as present with their clients in the same way. So that's probably the concern that's been most on my mind when it comes to some of the shifts that have happened lately.
Viewing a bunch of different people, other therapists in this field, and I've heard this theme before, right? I've brought up this theme before. I think all of us think about it because we're in the day-to-day daily grind of looking at our books, looking at the money, talking to our friends in the field. But what do you think, how do you think the world should, how would you like it to respond to this concern that's happening? Because I would love to think I have as much clout as some of these billionaires, but I live in Silicon Valley. I know I have
Right.
0.00001% version of their influence. So what do you think is you would like to see them do, or you would like to see these corporations do?
Like the corporations themselves that are, I don't know, the nice way to put it is, but they're seeing an opportunity here. And I think that they should really not cut corners when it comes to dotting the I's and crossing the T's. Like, for example, there's one company that they're based in America, and they have their American therapists serving people in Canada, which it's crossing borders, right? Like, you can't do that. And so it's not truly protecting the public. So things like that, in terms of making sure they're doing it properly, getting more feedback from therapists around what they need in terms of fee or other resources that can support them. Are they going to at least offer supervision or other things to compensate if it's going to be a little bit of a lower fee? Like, really to think, have that mentality of being a strong leader, like servant leadership. I don't know if you've ever heard of the idea leaders eat last, but it's this idea that putting your self-interest aside a little bit so that the team can truly thrive, which is a big ask when it comes to capitalism. It's tough when you're talking about, do I think these corporations always have that motivation for that? Maybe or maybe not, depending on their values. I guess if they're starting this type of business, I would hope that their values are there to think about it that way.
I think about it in the sense that it makes me think about the AI revolution, and I've really been trying to think about how I would like to use it, how I'm scared of it being used, how could it start to change the conversation. And to your point about they're here, we got to make accommodations for them and see how they're positives, but also try to be part of the conversation of how they could be a better part of the conversation. I think of AI as the same way. And CBT seems like the perfect place. There's so much CBT work that AI could help so much about. These big corporations using the AI to support their clients and support their therapists to provide better, more comprehensive therapy seems like an amazing opportunity and space. And it has to be paired with some of that servant leadership of being like, okay, yes, but that doesn't mean then I give this therapist another 10 clients, another 50 clients. That's the Kaiser model that just burns everybody out completely. But how can we do this so that we're supporting both people, both shareholders basically in this space? Does that actually allow us to, so they don't have to see 35 clients, they can see 25 clients, and that's actually really helpful. And so they have to work a little bit less. Because one thing I think maybe this is because I'm influenced by Silicon Valley, there is this kind of almost mentality of, oh, work harder, longer, I work hard, play hard. Mm-hmm. And therapy, it does not work that way because all of our work is so emotionally draining. We have to have room to recharge and reset because we have to hold all that emotional. We can't just show up to a meeting and be checked out. Like, we have to show up and be present and hold all that emotional energy for these people going through really hard stuff every single day, every single hour of our day. So it's not quite the same framework that I think some of these really hard charging people are thinking about in terms of the people working for them. What do you think?
Yeah, I totally agree. And it also makes me think about, I've heard some different kind of stats, but that 1 hour of therapy basically can equal anywhere from 2 hours of non-therapeutic work to 4. Like the intensity of focus that's required in a session is very high. Like a lot of people assume that therapists get traumatized from the work that they do. But I feel like it's better expressed that it's more about the mental, like your energy and your capacity is all so focused in that hour as you're attuned to the client and really paying attention that it takes a lot out of you in that sense. And also I feel like it's probably very likely that a lot of therapists have some type of neurodivergence, whether that's ADHD or being a highly sensitive person like an HSP. And at the very least, they trend toward being more empathic on that spectrum. And I feel like that also has to be considered. We can't do 40 hours of therapy a week and not burnt out. I think, again, depending on like which type of professional, the stats are a little bit different, whether you're like a social worker, psychologist, psychiatrist, but our field has one of about 60 to 85% of burnout. And so to me, that tells me that everyone's being underpaid and not given enough resources to be able to not just recover from the work that we do, but be able to thrive and flourish in it.
I was reading an interesting article that was talking about, does capitalism support short-term or long-term results? Because as a business, you want to build a long, sustainable business. And sometimes that means taking a short-term hit for a long-term goal. But capitalism doesn't, or the stock market specifically doesn't reward that, right? It rewards the short-term gain over the long-term gain. And I feel that way about paying therapists because, in the short term, giving them a higher rate or a higher salary hits your books. And everybody's looking at their books right now. I don't want to negate how important that is. But taking a smaller margin or taking a smaller piece or the hit there, but then being able to retain that therapist for 10 years versus having to get a new one and retrain them like every year or two. Because if you burn out too many therapists, eventually there's going to be a shortage and you're going to have to raise rates anyway, but you're probably going to have to double the raise that you would have given because there'll be so few of them, right?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Vision. Yeah. And I feel it's a little bit about scarcity versus abundant mindset too, because going back to that leaders eat last mentality. If the people at the top are having these big feasts and then giving the other people the scraps of what's left over, one that involves a scarcity mentality of, hey, if I pay these therapists more money, that means I'm going to get less. And my needs are prioritized here. And yeah, I feel like that's a mindset issue, and not just like selfish, but not just selfish, because everyone can get a lot and more than enough of what they need if it's approached the right way. Yeah, that's some of my thoughts about that.
Please, there was this really scary interview I was listening to, and I didn't go look at the research, so it's just a thought that I've been percolating on, because whether it's super in depth yet or it's just at its beginning phases, I read enough science fiction that I know we're going there, yeah. Which is, there's all these new AI models and there's all these data sets, and one of the biggest explosions is on something that's very rarely talked about, and I don't know a ton about because I hate video games. I feel bad because so many people love them, and I don't hate them from a moralistic standpoint. I'm just bored. I just get bored playing a video game, so they're not my thing. But there is this huge character play happening right now where there's this huge data set, and these characters are more and more representing how real people would engage. Their conversation is better, their reactions are more accurate, how they would respond. And so what this person was talking about was this idea that people are starting to form attachments. And especially, I don't know if you've seen this where you are, but we've seen a huge disconnection amongst people. So many communities are broken. So many people are isolated and alone. I would say a good 50% of my practice, people are single and lonely about it and want to change it. Like, they're not happy with that choice, right? Some people are very happy with that choice. A lot of people are not happy with that choice. And when I ask them what they're doing, what are they doing? A lot of them are staying home and they're playing video games. And I'm like, oh, so you've got a community of people you're playing, which is what I expected the answer to be. Like, oh, I talk to my friends via video games. And sometimes that's the answer. But a large portion of them are actually just forming relationships with these avatars, with these characters and they're feeling rejected when the changes happen or when this person's taking away, and they will pay money to have this connection. And whether I'm thinking about AI robots taking my job, or I'm thinking about people I might want to date who, they'll just date this AI version so they don't have to put up with my messiness. I think that's a place where I'm like, this is scary. Do we really want a society? Forget capitalism. And do you want a society where there's a bunch of people not actually forming connections and forming a connection to the AI over people in general?
Yeah. Just earlier today, for the first time on the platform I used to listen to like music and stuff, there was something called AI DJ. And I'd never tried it, but I put it on, and this really cool voice of someone that sounds very personable, and I'm like, this is really neat, but I feel totally manipulated, and because this feels like a real person when it's not. And I forget where I heard it, but there's some idea out there, I think it may have been a podcast, but someone was saying we need to get to a place where we can start learning how to tolerate each other again. I think the pandemic was a setback in that sense, but just the idea of going to a theater and then you hear people making noises and eating popcorn loud or whatever, being annoying. And then you're like, okay, or I could watch us at home and not be annoyed, which is true, but a lot is lost in terms of possible positive human connection with that as well. And I think maybe we've lost a little bit just due to lack of exposure of that ability to tolerate each other and our messiness that comes along with being human.
I think it goes back to what we started with, right? That idea of negotiation and flexible versus more rigid needs. And I think all of us, I would include myself and therapists in this categorization, all of us have lost a little sight of flexibility, because I think to tolerate human beings, we have to acknowledge, hey, they're not going to say exactly what I want the way I want it. Hey, I'm not going to get exactly what I want the way I want it. It's not going to be completely quiet. Like, going back to politics here in the States, right? Trying to accept that, like, just because somebody on the other side is saying something I don't like doesn't mean they deserve violence or they're the bad guys. They're just another human being with a different point of view who I think is annoying or silly or naive, whatever adjective you want to put on them. But I start with they're just another human being, and it's okay to tolerate that space in our discourse.
Yeah. And maybe this comes with the territory of being a therapist. But for me, and I don't know if this is about empathy, but for me it also just makes me curious about, okay, this person has this point of view. From their perspective and what I know about them, why might that be? Because there are reasons, probably deep reasons, why they have that point of view, even if it's harmful or even if you don't agree with it.
Yeah. Cecilia brought that up, this idea of curiosity, and that I brought up the idea that you and I have the luxury of getting really curious. That's a big part of why I love my job, is I get to ask the really deep, curious questions that not everybody has the space and time to ask. How are you encouraging people in your own community, in your own spaces, to lean into that idea?
Like the idea of curiosity?
Yeah, of asking that person you don't necessarily agree with or like.
Yeah. One of the things when it comes to curiosity that I often talk about is, that it's a marker of empathy. And I don't think people think about it that way. I think people think empathy is going, aw, to someone or feeling badly. And empathy is about the ability to try to imagine being in someone else's shoes. And that means going beyond your own initial emotional reaction or whatever's coming up for you, and then saying, I wonder what that's about. So I like talking about curiosity as a facet of empathy, and that what it can do is at least give you freedom from the feeling of frustration about how that other person is in the world.
Yeah. That's a good way of putting it, freedom from how they are being in this world.
Yeah.
I also love that it's not just an I think sometimes we do associate empathy with, I feel bad for you, or pity. And pity is completely separate from empathy, right? It's not saying I agree with your choices. It's saying, hey, I want to understand enough to know how these choices were generated, how you came to be in them. And I can still stand here and say my values would generate a different set of options, a different set of choices. But I want to put that aside and understand how you got here, understand how those values produced this choice and this result.
Yeah. And in fact, pity might not be empathic at times, because it's also can be a projection and an assumption of, this poor person. But if you ask that person about it, they might say, well, I'm glad this happened, or I learned this, or who knows, right?
Yeah. One of the things I've learned from my clients is how many people will say, I am happier having failed my way than having achieved it somebody else's way. And they're not interested in pity.
Yeah.
They're also not interested in the way I would encourage them to take an approach. They just want help accepting the consequences of how they wanted to do it.
Yeah. It makes me think about what you were saying with the nonviolent communication, and I always think of the emotions and needs going in together, and about, we don't know what that person's needs are until we ask, even though we're like, if I went through this, I would need this. but we're all so individual. And I think on the other hand, I'll acknowledge I've been a therapist for 10 years now, and I'm still learning or trying to become more and more empathic and emotionally intelligent. It's like a lifelong thing you could work on. It is a lot of work to set aside and say, hey, I just had an automatic reaction. Where's a moment here where I can maybe shift that up and try to be curious about what's happening?
We've gone all over. I've thrown my usual interview questions out a little bit, but I do want to start to wrap it up and bring it back to resources, which is a big reason I started this channel, which is I've seen a real divorce in terms of who can afford therapy, but also who needs therapy. I remember being on a dating app and seeing somebody like, I'm in therapy and uninterested in anybody who's not. And I was like, are you kidding me? Because not everybody needs therapy, right? So a big part of this channel for me was for people who are never going to come to therapy or don't want to come to therapy, or maybe they come for a specific piece and then they leave and then they come back. And so for those people who don't necessarily want to come to therapy or they're not ready to right now, what would be a resource they could use to help access some of this curiosity, help be a little bit more empathetic in their daily lives with the people around them?
The whole needing therapy is a giant topic, and my perspective on that is I think one of the problems is that the term psychotherapy has been medicalized. So now it's at least in Ontario, offering psychotherapy as a controlled act. It's considered a health act, which is valid and fair to view it that way. But my definition of psychotherapy is way broader than that. It can be about treating anxiety, depression, trauma, etc. But it also could be about so much more. It doesn't have to involve that per se. Take Jungian approaches or dream analysis. You could get benefits to those, like your feelings of anxiety and depression could decrease by just as a byproduct of doing that process. But it can also address so much more, and it doesn't necessarily have to be about that. So I think part of this discussion is about how our societies have just really narrowed down what it is to offer psychotherapy. For me, it's more about growth than healing, but it's defined as healing from a mental health condition. Having said that, the number one resource I'd recommend to anyone for anything, whether it's mental health or just learning more about themselves, is a book called Reinventing Your Life by Jeffrey Young. And it's basically schema therapy in a nutshell, which does have a combined CBT, but more so psychoanalytic point of view. And it's just about trying to identify the worldviews. There's about 12 or 13 common worldviews that can come up called schemas, like a filter that you look at yourself or the world through, usually of some degree of the flavor of I'm not enough in some way, but different variations of that, and the causes of what leads into different types or each schema. And so that would be my number one recommendation to anyone wanting to make a shift. And if you can go to therapy and talk about that book with your therapist, that's ideal. But if you don't want to go to therapy and you just want to explore that, I think that could be really transformative.
I love that idea, and I'm definitely it'll be in the show notes, but I'm also gonna check it out for myself because I love a good schema book.
Oh, no.
But it made me think about this idea of what to bring into therapy, right? I always say all the time to a lot of my clients, to my friends, to myself, which is there is nothing I can do that's not already in a book, right? There are a lot of self-help books out there. Just like there's a lot of health books, physical get in shape books, diet books. The reason you go to therapy is because having a person challenge you, push you, offer a different interpretation, accept you, there is value in that the book cannot give you. And that is where therapy really helps you grow. Yes, I think all of our knowledge is really valuable and helpful, and not everybody wants to read a book. Great. That's a good reason to go to therapy. And I still think that it's the experience of being accepted and challenged and exploring who you are in a way where it's really safe. There are bad therapists out there, absolutely, but I also know mostly really great therapists, and every single one of them is going to hold a space where who you are is amazing, and they're going to help you see that. And that doesn't mean you don't make mistakes and you don't screw up. And you and I were just offline having a conversation of how it's so terrifying being on internet, because we both know we probably put our foot in our mouth at least once. But that doesn't make us a bad person. And having a genuine person say that and believe that and operate in that space has a lot of value in and of itself. To your point about needing it from the health model, having someone accept you, I don't know that's a recognized, diagnosable need, but I think as a human being operating in the world, there's a lot of growth and value in that.
Yeah, and I think there's a ton of research that shows, regardless what type of therapy you use, the really healing part is the therapeutic relationship more than anything at all. And I've reflected personally on my own values, and I think what my top value used to be was intelligence or insight. And that's one of the things I love about schema therapy and why I use it. Cracking down on patterns and what's going on can be so useful. But I think what's even more transformative than that is experiencing empathy from another person and having maybe with a therapist, it could even potentially be your only relationship or your first relationship where you experience trust and safety. And then that creates a new template for other safe relationships to come forward, because that might be entirely new for you.
Yes.
So
I think that's a great, we started with a resource if you don't want to go to therapy, but ended about all the different ways therapy can be wonderful. As we sign off, why don't you tell my audience a little bit about what you offer and where they can find it?
Sure. Right now I'm offering a free complimentary phone call of 20 minutes, or we can do video call around dream analysis. So if you're curious about analyzing your dreams and want to chat about that, you can feel free to go to my website. It's RebeccaAnnSteele.com, or my Instagram is Rebecca.Ann.Steele, and we can set up a time to have a chat.
All right, lovely. I'll put that in the show notes, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Yes, thanks for having me.